I'm Sudesh Kumar. I'm the Dean of Medicine at Warwick Medical School. I think events like this are terribly important, and even more so in times like this, when we are all disconnected and not able to meet each other in the workplace, etc. So I'm glad you're able to join. It's also, I like these events because it's a wonderful opportunity to hear about the work of some of our professors and in some depth. And actually this, it's very good to hear about this time. I always learn something new at these lectures. The other thing, for those of you not familiar, Leading Lights is the brand we give the series of lectures, which are in many universities, they call them inaugural lectures. So when you become a professor, you're effectively inaugurated. So you give an inaugural lecture, and which is a deeply personal occasion, because this is the one time you give a lecture quite a bit about your own journey as a professor and how you got here. So, so it's actually quite a different type of lecture to most of the lectures that professors are used to giving. So, so it should be quite a good experience for you, Felicity. But we all like to hear more about your journey here and about the work you do. So the usual way we do this is I would invite Felicity to do the lecture, and after she finishes her lecture, if I could invite all of you to unmute your microphones and show appreciation in the usual way, and then after that, we are going to improvise and do something we normally do when we do the lectures in person. So anyway, I won't spoil the surprise. We'll do it at that time. If everything worked to plan, Felicity will have received something I would have normally passed to her in person. After that, there are no question answers or anything like that. We will just disperse after that. At that point, it is absolutely fine, Felicity, if you wish to meet with your family and friends. You continue on this meeting. The rest of us will then go away back to our work. So without much further ado, I'd like to tell you a bit about Felicity and the journey here. So she completed a PhD in 2010, and Felicity's career has been quite impressive in that she's got numerous, she's won numerous personal fellowships, usually a mark of being appreciated by peers and in key funding bodies. So off the top of my head, I remember the Mildred Baxter Fellowship. I remember ESRC Future Leaders Fellowship, a Welcome Investigator Award. And I've recently been alerted to the fact that she's a foundation fellow of the Warwick Institute for Engagement. In fact, I think you're the only one I know from the medical school at this point. So I don't know if there's anybody else who's succeeded in joining. But so I think we've got a good track record of success over many years. Her particular area of work is around genetic diseases, the ethics, communication, patient engagement, and issues like that. And actually, some of it has led to some good work by her, empirical work that is relevant to actual healthcare in these areas. But in addition to that, she's also joined and supported grant applications by other colleagues as part of multidisciplinary applications. So I think it's quite an interesting area, and probably a much more important area as we go forward with more of precision medicine and more targeted therapies around rare genetic diseases. So this is something I'm looking forward to hearing with interest. So without much further ado, I'm now going to invite Felicity to give her lecture.
Thank you very much. I have to say, when I got the date through for this lecture, I smiled a little bit at the coincidence. The 13th of January is and always will be a date that sticks in my mind, because it was on this day 20 years ago that the 16-year-old me was being wheeled into theatre with a stereotactic frame clamped to my forehead as I was about to undergo 6 hours of brain surgery. The surgery I was having was deep brain stimulation. It was an operation that at the time in January 2001 was still regarded as experimental, especially in cases of generalized torsion dystonia. And this was the condition that I'd been diagnosed with as a child. And you can see here an X-ray of what a deep brain stimulator looks like. Now, the surgery hadn't been done much at all at this point in patients with generalized torsion dystonia at the time that I had it done. However, it was a last-ditch attempt to get my muscle tone under control. The condition at this point was causing muscle spasms throughout my body that were so severe that they'd been dislocating my wrists. And just before the surgery, I was facing the possibility of amputation of part of my right foot because my foot was contorted into a position where the blood flow had been cut off and some of the tissue was dying. And after a total of 2 brain surgeries, both around 6-7 hours each, and 6 subsequent battery changes, so I have a battery in my chest that powers this device, the surgery's largely been considered a success. Over time, it's given me back control of my upper body, although my legs have remained somewhat more resistant to treatment, and I've undergone nerve blocks in my legs to help control muscle tone. I'm telling you this story because the surgery and the aftermath of it was such a pivotal moment in my life, and one that shaped much of my life since, including my research career. Although, funnily enough, it's also been something that I spent a lot of time trying to ignore, and it's been a subject that I've been really reticent about talking about, and I was quite nervous about bringing it up today. And I think in the earliest part of my research career, I think I used to think that to acknowledge my own personal experience of disability would in some way threaten my identity as a researcher. Yeah, I called this lecture Valuing Lived Experience because much of my career has been spent exploring the way that our experiences or our experiential knowledge shape our actions and our decisions. And part of that journey for me has been about acknowledging my own. So living with a condition that fluctuated considerably over my early years in terms of the degree of pain, functioning and disability that I've experienced meant that I was quite reflective from a young age about the insights that personal experience with a medical condition can give you, as well as the roles of both biology and society in creating those experiences. And later on in my early 20s, I discovered the genetic origin of my condition. And later on, when it came to the question of having children of my own, I had to face some quite confronting questions about how I would feel about potentially having a child with the same condition as myself. And this process made me evaluate the sorts of experiences I'd had. And it also made me realise what expertise I had as someone who knew so well the daily realities of my condition. I began to realise, who better to make a decision about having a child with the same condition than someone who has it themselves. But I also had to consider the dilemmas it gave me as well. If I was unprepared to have a child with the same condition as myself, what would I be saying about the value of my own life? And for me, this rather complex and messy process by which personal experience of disability gets translated into reproductive decisions was the seed of thought from which my doctoral thesis grew, because I wanted to gain a better understanding of how people who have personal experience of the condition they could potentially transmit, use and value that experience, particularly amongst those who face what could be described as highly genetically risky reproductive decisions. So between 2006 and 2010, I set out to explore exactly that, focusing my work on the recessively inherited condition spinal muscular atrophy. SMA was and is a condition that greatly interests me. It's a neuromuscular condition that causes widespread muscle weakness and respiratory complications. Not only had I grown up with a close friend with the condition, but I was also interested in it because the families living with it had such a wide variety of experiences with it. So its presentations range from a condition that causes early infantile death in its most severe form, type 1, to a later onset, sometimes even an adult onset form of muscle weakness. Sorry, my slides are moving on. Muscle weakness, and everything in between those two severities. However, for the families living with these conditions, oh, my slides have gone. I'll put them back up. Slides seem to have disappeared.
Felicity, just to let you know, I'm on standby if you want me to try and share something.
Okay, I don't know why they went off. They're coming back. Just going to wait for them to load up. They were dancing backwards and forwards a bit before they went, so I'm not sure if there's a... Okay.
I wonder if there's a bandwidth problem. Maybe Claire could share the screen and you could talk to that.
Do you want to do that?
I'm quite happy to do that, but it looks like something's coming back now.
Yeah, it's come back.
I'll give it one more go.
Yeah, can I just ask if everybody could, I think everybody's muted, but if people can turn off their videos as well, that would be grand, just to, anything we can do to just save a bit of bandwidth. Thank you.
So SMA is a condition where the presentations range from a condition that causes early infantile death in its most severe form, SMA type 1, to a later onset, sometimes adult onset form of muscle weakness in SMA type 4, and everything in between those two severities. However, for the families who have an affected child, there's often some uncertainty about how it might affect subsequent children. So I met several families who had one child who was diagnosed with SMA type 2 and their next child had SMA type 3. So there was some uncertainty around prognosis. And I wanted to explore that uncertainty and its relationship to their lived experiences. So in the end, I undertook 64 in-depth interviews with various family members, parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, people with SMA themselves, and with people who had experiences with the full spectrum of presentations of SMA. So right through from type 1 to type 4, and also with people who had experience with the variant types of SMA as well. And this research really brought home to me the key role that lived experience plays in shaping interpretations of medical knowledge, but also its value in challenging medical knowledge as well. The families used their experiences in various ways. They used it to imagine what a future life affected by SMA might look like. And sometimes they also used it to create certainty even when there was none, and to create meaning around events that were actually seemingly random. So experiential knowledge emerged from my thesis as a form of expertise in and of itself, that whilst very different to medical types of knowledge, was ultimately just as important and sometimes even more important in guiding people's reproductive decisions. The years following my thesis were ones of rapid technological change in the field of genetics, and this in turn has had a huge impact on the direction that my research has taken. So the development of fast and effective whole genome sequencing techniques means that an organism's entire genome can be sequenced in around an hour. And this increased accessibility of genomic data has massively affected its role and its future within NHS healthcare. And this was set out in the October Genome UK strategy. It's seen as playing a particularly important role in accelerating the personalisation of healthcare, as well as shaping the future of preventative and predictive medicine. And population screening programmes are also being affected by these developments in genetics. So, for example, in Australia and the Netherlands, whole genome sequencing is currently being used for preconception screening of couples, so before pregnancy or sometimes in early pregnancy, to identify carrier couples. So they have large panels of genetic conditions and they screen these people to see if they're both carriers of the same condition and whether they could potentially be transmitting a condition that they were unaware of to their future child. But also here in the UK, there's currently a public dialogue being undertaken to explore attitudes amongst the public towards the use of whole genome sequencing as a screening tool for all newborn babies in the UK. So the idea of sequencing a newborn baby in order to look for any inherited conditions they may have. But this sequencing would also potentially generate findings that could be used to identify their propensity to future conditions or their carrier status for genetic conditions. And there's also been the development of genome editing techniques. So these could be used to alter and correct pathogenic variants, as well as the emergence of new gene therapies to treat conditions that were largely considered untreatable. Indeed, in the 6 years since I completed, 6 years after I completed my thesis, the first ever treatment for SMA was licensed in the UK. And this rapidly changing context has meant that it's been a really exciting time to be exploring the social and ethical implications of genetic technologies, because the evolving capabilities of these technologies significantly alter the landscape of the debates around genetics. And I wanted to explore this further, and I particularly wanted to know more about what genetic screening means for already affected families. So in 2014, I was awarded a 3-year ESRC fellowship to explore further the social and ethical implications of population-level genetic screening, but focusing specifically on the perspectives of families living with genetic disease and comparing them to people from the general population. I'd already seen the importance of lived experience to the reproductive decisions of SMA families. And I wanted to know what happened when the sorts of decisions that those SMA families are making are extended to people within the general population, which is essentially what a screening programme is doing. I wanted to know, is it possible to make informed reproductive decisions about rare genetic conditions that you are likely to have never heard of or come across before? And what are the consequences of population screening for rare genetic conditions like SMA amongst families who already live with those conditions? I began to wonder, if population screening were introduced for rare genetic disease and the number of children born with those conditions as a consequence began to decrease over time, could lived experience of these conditions, which I'd already found to be so critical to making informed decisions, become a scarce resource in the future? And what did affected families think about this? And did their views on screening differ from those of the general population who don't have access to their insights and experiences? And to answer some of these questions, I turned to mixed methods research techniques, so the combination of surveys and in-depth interviews, because I wanted to gauge the attitudes of families on a large scale, but I also wanted to combine these findings with a more nuanced understanding of how they formulated their perceptions of population screening. So this is what the project looked like, with the quantitative survey being informed by initial in-depth interviews. And it was done this way to ensure that my survey questions reflected the views of SMA families. And once the survey results of the families was obtained, a second survey of the general population was launched to see whether there were differences between those with lived experience of the condition and those without lived experience in terms of their views on screening.
As far as
So this piece of research was really important in terms of being able to disentangle some of the complexities around these families' views towards screening. Within the surveys, I found that there was widespread support for SMA screening. The families really supported the idea of carrier screening and newborn screening, but there was a lot of reticence around the issue of prenatal screening, and this is largely due to its association with selective pregnancy termination. But a key finding of this project was that support for screening was directly related to how severe the families saw the condition as being. The more severe they saw it as being, the higher their support for screening. However, what I also found was that their ideas of severity did not always line up with clinical definitions of severity. So what was really striking was that those with type 2 SMA, and this is an intermediate form of SMA, were much more likely than those with milder types of SMA, so types 3 and 4, to view SMA positively and therefore have negative ideas about screening. And I found this finding quite interesting within the survey, and I used the qualitative interviews to explore it further. And from this analysis, it became clear that factors such as the relative stability of the symptoms of SMA type 2 over time were really key. So SMA types 3 and 4, so whilst they'd be understood to be clinically milder in their presentation, they onset later in life and they involved a process of gradual deterioration, whereas people affected by type 2 SMA were typically never able to walk, but their level of impairment, remained quite stable over time. As one woman with type 2 SMA commented when she was comparing her experiences of SMA with those of her sister who had type 3 SMA. And she said to me, "Everyone expects me to be the bitter one because I can't walk and have never been able to, whereas she still can. But the reality is I never lost anything, but she has. She has to look at herself and think, I could do that last year, but now I can't, whereas I've always been the same. You don't miss the things you've never had, do you?" So an understanding of the nature of the experience a person has with a condition became emerged as being really critical to unpicking their views around severity, which in turn influenced the attitudes they had towards screening programmes. And as I said, importantly, these were often different to clinical definitions of severity. So whilst SMA type 2 would be considered more severe than type 3, it became clear that the lived reality of the condition did not necessarily reflect this categorisation. But also I found a lack of lived experience could also have a significant impact on views around severity. So the views of the general population, which were derived from the second survey and compared to the SMA data, showed that the general public perceived SMA to be a much more severe condition than the families who lived with it did. And this in turn meant that the public were much more supportive of the idea of conducting reproductive screening for SMA and preventing the condition from occurring in future generations. And it was at this point in my research journey that I became really interested in gaining a deeper understanding of the concept of disease severity or seriousness and what characterises it. I'd already found out that the way that people living with clinically severe conditions do not necessarily experience it or define it as severe, yet some did, and I wanted to understand the differences between those groups. After all, the concept of disease severity is so critical. It's something that's rarely defined, but it governs policy decisions around screening. So, for example, a condition has to be considered serious to even be a candidate condition for a screening programme. But it's also used to determine access to things like late-stage abortions or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And the countries that are implementing preconception genetic screening are also using this notion of seriousness to decide which conditions get screened for. So it's a really pivotal concept, but there isn't a formal definition of it, and it's an extremely sort of nebulous concept, and I wanted to delve into it a bit further. So this interest in understanding what a serious condition is and exploring it from the perspective of people living with genetic conditions led to another research project, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust, and this is the one that I'm due to complete later this year. And this project, again, it used mixed methods approaches, so it involved interviews and surveys, but it was designed to expand my research. So it didn't just include SMA, but included lots of different conditions. Because I wanted to explore perceptions of population screening and disease severity from the perspectives of people living with highly contrasting conditions, to try to get a better understanding from their perspective about what makes a condition severe, and to get an understanding of what they thought a screening programme would have meant for them and their family had it been available to them. So these are the conditions that were included in the study. The conditions were chosen because of their broad range of impacts, and this was to facilitate comparison. So I included conditions for which there are treatments, as well as those for which there aren't. Multi-system conditions like cystic fibrosis, conditions that disproportionately affect ethnic minority groups. So I included thalassemia, which predominantly affects families of South Asian, Mediterranean and Middle Eastern origin. And I also included Fragile X syndrome because that causes intellectual impairment and behavioural problems, whereas the other conditions have more physical impacts. So I wanted to include a range of conditions that were associated with a broad range of experiences. And I also included families who were undergoing whole genome sequencing through the 100,000 Genomes project due to a rare disease in their family. And I included these people as I wanted to explore their views on receiving incidental findings, such as carrier status, from their sequence. So an incidental finding is essentially a finding that's unrelated to the rare condition in their family, but may be of interest to them. And this was to explore how experience with one condition might alter perceptions around receiving incidental information that relates to other conditions. And I recruited these families through a variety of means, through regional genetic services, through support groups, patient registries, and through NHS clinics as well. And I worked with the support groups that represented each of these conditions, and they were really pivotal in the research process because they really helped to shape my data collection methods. So they did things like they reviewed my interview schedules and the surveys for me, and they also provided their input on the direction that the analysis was taking as well. And so this project in the end resulted in 146 in-depth interviews and 1,273 survey responses from families living with the conditions on the slide. But in addition to this, there were the 31 in-depth interviews with people undergoing whole genome sequencing as part of the 100,000 Genome project as well. And through the interviews and the surveys, I gathered data on these various aspects. I asked them about their life with their condition, its daily impacts. I asked them about their perceptions of the severity of the condition, whether they viewed it as a serious condition, their views on the potential prevention of their condition through reproductive screening, as well as its early identification through newborn screening. But I also asked them about their experiences, views and expectations with regards to treatment and cure as well. And what I found was that there were dramatic differences in perspectives across and within the conditions. And you can see here two short quotes that demonstrate the polarity of the views between these participants. The first is from Azim, and he was a 43-year-old man who was living with beta thalassemia, and he saw thalassemia as a devastating condition and one which he ultimately wanted to see eradicated through the process of reproductive screening. And he said, thalassemia is a terrible illness to live with. I mean, you have your freedom, but it's always on a leash. You'll soon get poorly again and need another transfusion. That's no life, is it? If you can screen for it and stop these lives from happening, then why wouldn't you? It's a no-brainer, surely. And then in contrast to that, we have here a second quote, which is from a 42-year-old woman with cystic fibrosis. And she had the view that CF is one of the many difficult things that can happen in life. and it isn't something that should be the focus of reproductive screening. And she said, people think that life with cystic fibrosis is this terrible burden. They expect me to be quite miserable, and it comes with its challenges for sure. But for me, CF is not a strong reason not to bring a child into the world. There are lots of things that make life challenging. CF is just one among many other. Screening is fine for information, but not when it might become about getting rid of people with CF. A key part of my research has been about exploring why these differences of perception occur across the conditions, why some people were more likely to see their condition as part of their identity, and sometimes even, as that last quote demonstrated, a relatively benign characteristic of theirs amongst many, whereas other people were more likely to see the condition as an unwelcome burden on their lives. And my analysis of the data showed that the following factors were quite important in influencing these perceptions. So firstly, the age of onset of the condition. So people whose conditions started early in life, in early childhood, were more likely to view their condition as part of their self-identity than people were whose conditions onset later in life. Those with early onset conditions had set their lives up around their condition. It wasn't something that intruded on their life later on. Yet, if we were to look at an early onset condition versus a late onset one, in terms of things like quality adjusted life years, earlier onset conditions will probably come out looking like they are more severe. But it was interesting that this research showed that wasn't necessarily how they were being lived by the participants. The second factor was around whether or not there was deterioration. So people whose conditions were stable were much more likely to be well adjusted to their condition and see it as part of who they were. Those people whose conditions deteriorated often had to do quite complex identity work, continually having to negotiate and renegotiate their sense of self around their changing abilities. Illness and pain, in other words, how far participants felt that their condition caused them to suffer. So for those who had conditions that didn't cause pain and it didn't make them feel particularly unwell, there was often less of a desire to see the condition prevented. They were more likely to see the condition as a form of difference than a disease. Yet those who experienced frequent periods of illness and pain were much more likely to support eradication of their condition. And finally, but not least importantly, social conditions and stigma. So the way that a person's condition was experienced in their social and environmental context had a huge influence on their perceptions of the condition and whether or not they thought it should be treated or prevented. And many actually argued that they thought that improving those aspects of their lives, things like the accessibility of society, was as important, if not more important, than medical treatment for their condition. And stigma also played an important role in determining people's life experiences and their life chances. And this came out particularly strongly amongst some of the families living with thalassemia. Many participants reported that thalassemia was a highly stigmatized trait amongst particular ethnic minority communities, and that the stigma of it could be as damaging to a person's life chances as the thalassemia itself. So all of these factors appeared really important in terms of how severe the participants thought their condition was. Yet not all of these factors would necessarily be included when evaluating disease severity from a clinical perspective. And to me, this really underscored the importance of including the voices of people living with genetic conditions in decisions around which conditions are screened for, particularly as it relates to reproductive screening, which have implications for the whole of society. Now, given that there's been surprisingly little previous work on the perspectives of people living with genetic conditions and their attitudes towards population screening, and also that members of the public don't typically have access to the views of these families, I've been able to get involved in some really interesting engagement and impact work with the findings of this project. Ranging from including their views in evidence reviews for screening policies, and as well as contributing to things like parliamentary inquiries and bringing their perspectives into debates and reports around new technologies such as non-invasive prenatal testing. But I've also been able to take the insights of this research to the support groups as well. So the support groups are often called upon to take a position on screening, either to lobby for it or against it. And so by doing this research on screening, I was able to bring the perspectives of these families to the support groups so that they could better represent the views of their members and join appropriate campaigns. However, I've also tried to target healthcare professionals, and I've listed there some of the healthcare professionals who I've spoken to and brought the findings of the research to. But it was also really important to me to bring the research to people who might not otherwise be in the world of genetics and genetic conditions. So I tried to reach them through engagement with the media, and I put on Café Scientifique workshops as well. I've done quite a few of those to bring this topic to people who might otherwise never encounter it. Indeed, I was lucky enough to secure a Research Enrichment Award from the Wellcome Trust, and this is an award that runs alongside my Investigator Award. And it's to help with the public engagement part of it. And it was through this award that a collaboration with Santé Theatre was formed. And they helped to put together an immersive art installation based on the findings of the research, and this was called iDNA. Now, this installation uses verbatim quotes from the research interviews, and through the use of a large double helix sculpture, the use of song, theatre, the use of filmed portraits of a wide variety of faces, Santé Theatre have created a space where members of the public can physically enter and see and hear different perspectives on genetics and views about the lived realities of genetic conditions being voiced. And this installation has been touring since September 2019, and so far it's visited the British Science Festival, Oxford Science and Ideas Festival, the ESRC Festival of Social Science, but it's also done a stint at the think tank at Millennium Point in Birmingham. Recently, however, with COVID, it's had to move online. And you can see the address at the bottom there if you're interested in having a look at the online version of the installation. But I have included here a few photos of iDNA from when it visited Coventry Cathedral. So you can see some images of the sculpture, the screened portraits, the scanner style entry system that we had in the piece. And this was designed to be reminiscent of an airport scanner. But we also held launch events at each new venue that we went to with it. So we held talks, Q&A sessions and performances at each one. And we had a dedicated research associate who was there to curate the installation and answer questions from the public throughout the time it was displayed. So it was a great way to get people talking about a topic that they probably would not have encountered otherwise. I've got here a video with short excerpts of the soundscape and some images of the sculpture.
I really enjoyed the sculpture. I thought it was really interesting about how it's metallic, but it's also got that human element to it. And it's really nice hearing all the voices as well, and the kind of the choral, soothing nature, even though it's quite a difficult subject. I think it all holds it together really well.
The consultant was keen for us to have an amniocentesis. He couldn't convince me of the benefit compared to the cost. We were struggling to find a benefit to offset the risk.
a very interesting concept of putting baggages and handbags onto a DNA model, and the short films are very nicely taken. It's very simple. At the same time, it's got lots of information.
It's like having a soul.
I saw the sculpture and then I watched the videos, and it made me really think about what the role is in genetic testing. I think it's a really good way of doing it, because if people can come and participate with a piece of artwork, this is a really good way of sort of priming people with the lived experiences of people to sort of make them consider it from their point of view.
Okay, I hope you've all managed to have a look at the video. If not, then it might be something that you can look at after the presentation. So far, iDNA has reached 1,755 people, and it's due to complete its tour later this year. It's actually got a 12-month residency booked in for the art gallery in the Pump Rooms in Leamington Spa. And during the tour of this installation, we tried to mix the venues to include science festivals as well as art and cultural venues as well. And we wanted to attract audiences other than those who were just interested in science. For example, when it was installed in Coventry Cathedral, it was mostly visited by people who weren't expecting it to be there. And it was a way for us to bring people in who would never otherwise have experienced an installation like this. And the feedback was really positive for iDNA, and if you've heard the video, you will have been able to hear some excerpts of that. And it was perhaps even more positive than I'd anticipated for something that blends research and art. And we've had some really great conversations and engagement with members of the public who came up to us to talk about what they'd taken away from the installation. In terms of next steps and looking to the future, 2021 will see me completing my Investigator Award as well as my Enrichment Award. And as I mentioned, iDNA is going to the Art Gallery in Leamington Spa. And I'll also be completing my analysis and papers from this study. But I've also got some funding to extend my work around SMA in light of the new treatments for the condition that have come out. So I'm going to be exploring how and whether the developments of treatment change attitudes towards newborn screening for the condition. And in a similar vein, I'm involved in several projects that are exploring the implications of using whole genome sequencing for the purposes of newborn screening. And as I mentioned earlier, this is something that could be piloted here in the UK. However, moving on from that, I'll also be setting up some data sharing workshops with another Wellcome Trust grant later on this year. And this project will be rolled out over the next 2 years and is aimed at researchers working on the social and ethical implications of genetics. And the workshops will function as spaces to share research data and data analysis, and to identify cost-cutting themes in our research, as well as to identify future research agendas. And in the future, I hope to also expand my work around screening through an exploration of public perceptions and expectations of screening programmes as we're moving into a genomic age. So this would include the question of how we define a serious condition, but within the public imagination, and how the public balance the perceived harms and benefits of screening. And finally, I started with my personal story, so I'll also finish with it. Alongside this journey through research on reproduction and genetics, I also faced my own personal decisions about having children in the face of a genetic diagnosis, the results of which you can see on this slide. Considering the possibility of transmitting my condition to my children was a difficult thought, and one that brought up such conflicting feelings. On the one hand, I had my conviction that life with disability is still inherently valuable. And that idea was really important to me. But on the other hand, I had this sort of instinct that I wanted to shield my children from any possible difficulty in life. And there was no doubt in my mind that disability can make life more challenging. And it was the same push and pull that I recognised in many of my participants' stories, yet one that I spent much of my research career trying to bracket off and ignore for various reasons. How we define what a severe disease is and which conditions should be the targets of genomic medicine are inherently political decisions, as they can ultimately affect which people and with which genotypes may enter the world. Personal experience of my own condition both complicated my decision around reproduction, but also in many ways made it clearer. And if I was left in any doubt about the impact of personal experience on perceptions of disease severity, I had it brought home to me just the other month when I was taking my youngest son, Blake, to school. A friend of his, who's also in year 1, looked really wistfully at me out the corner of his eye. And he said, "I feel really sorry for your mum, Blake." And he was saying this in a really humorously loud attempt at a whisper. And he said, "I feel sorry for her because she can't run." And I wasn't sure how Blake was going to react at first, but he surprised me when he burst out laughing. And he said, "I really don't." He said, "With her power wheels, she can go faster than all of us." Thank you for listening, and I wanted to say a huge thank you to all of my friends and family who have joined here today, and also to my mentors and supporters from within Warwick. I've been really lucky to work with some incredible people who've been hugely supportive of my career, and I can't thank them enough for that, and the opportunities they've given me and the time they've given up to support me. And I think I saw Hannah Bradby might also be here, who also deserves a mention, who was my PhD supervisor. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you. Can I ask everyone to unmute their microphones and give a great big cheer? Thank you, Felicity. And like always, I've actually learned a lot of new things from this lecture. But more importantly, what came across was what a great role model you are. And actually being able to understand your motivation for doing this work was also really good to see. The work you're doing, of course, is terribly important now and contemporary because science is producing new possibilities. But without the research that you're doing, it'll be very difficult to move forward in terms of implementation of policy. So, and I'm sure you'll get plenty of opportunities for work in this area in the future, because as gene editing and other technologies have become available. So at this stage, normally I would pass on to you a memento of this occasion, something that we have magically managed to transport virtually. No, we've used very conventional methods, but there you are. There. So that's my virtual handshake, and I'll pass on that to you. So once again, thank you very much for that really inspiring lecture.